and
Oh, you're the co-host. Well, go for it. Oh, I thought it was Ryan.
across. Ryan, I think, got the ball rolling on the whole consortium plan.
Okay, well, good, wonderful. Go
Right.
ahead, Alex.
Maybe one more minute. There's still people joining. Where's your better half there, Michael?
She said she was going on her computer. She may be in one of these screens. I haven't seen them all.
I haven't seen her come on yet.
There are a lot of screens here.
There are a lot of screens here. No, I can't find you.
I don't see her, Ruff, in a quick survey. So, yeah. Well, you know, I'm going to say a few things about her, so she'll be sorry that she's not listening.
Well, you know, you're being recorded right now.
I know that.
There she is. Now we can start.
Okay.
Okay. I may get interrupted, but I'm going to just let everybody know that we are recording this. There's a few people that were not able to make the colloquium today, so they asked if we would record it. And I don't know that Michael really needs an introduction to this crew, but I thought just by way of thanks, at least to him for presenting these wonderful chapters on Lincoln from his book manuscript on Lincoln, I would read from a paragraph I wrote for a letter for him. Why I was writing a letter on his behalf, I don't know, but and I could say a lot about influence as a teacher. We have some of his former students here, but I'm just going to focus on his scholarly work and just mainly to remind us of its breadth and depth. The cornerstone of Michael's work is the set of 3 books that establish his reputation as a scholar of Locke and the American founding, Natural Rights and the New Republicanism, The Natural Rights Republic, and Launching Liberalism, John Locke and the Liberal Revolution. Yet a quick a survey of Michael's publication record reveals his depth and breadth as a scholar. In addition to his 2 books on Leo Strauss, co-written with the more brilliant of the Zuckert couple, Catherine, Michael has published monographs, edited volumes, journal articles, review essays, and book chapters, as well as a radio show and a stage play on a wide range of thinkers in the history of thought. These include Jefferson, Adams, Madison, Paine, Tocqueville, Lincoln, Plato, Cicero, Aquinas, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Blackstone, Rawls, Nozick, Shakespeare, Twain, and Orwell. He has also published on a wide range of topics, including many problems of constitutionalism, the Federalist-Anti-Federalist debates, questions of hermeneutics and epistemology, and the history of natural law and natural right. Yet, however widely Michael ranges, his scholarship inevitably returns to its concern with the promise and problems of the American political experiment and to his continuous study of the possibility of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And I think we see that concern in these chapters from his study of Lincoln, to which we can now turn. So our usual way of proceeding, Michael, is that you speak for 10 to 15 minutes, tell us what you think we need to know, and then we'll go to question and answer. I will keep the queue as well as I can. If you would use the electronic hand, it's either down under reactions, or you can go onto the participants list and find it under your name. So I'll be looking for the hands that go up electronically. If you have trouble with that, either send me a chat or let me know one way or the other. All right, Michael?
Good. Thanks, Sue, for that very nice introduction. At least you didn't read off the list of places where I've taught, but it makes me sound like I can't keep a job. So I'm grateful to you for not having done that. I just also want to say greetings to everybody out there. I haven't scrolled through all the screens here, but it's great to see so many of you, people I know. I didn't know I knew that many people, actually. So that's kind of nice to see you all. I wish we had a chance to, each of us individually, to have a bit of a chat here, but probably that's not going to happen. In any case, I thought I'd make maybe a little briefer statement than Sue just signed me up for. So as I think is clear from the text that I sent out, this is the main reading is a chapter from my forthcoming or just completed, better to say, book on Lincoln. This is a book focused on Lincoln's political thought, and my aim in it is to provide a somewhat comprehensive, rather comprehensive, I hope, account of Lincoln's thought. Unlike many works on Lincoln that focus on his thought, however, I also spend a lot of attention on his political deeds, that is, Lincoln as a statesperson, I guess we could say. That ended up happening not by plan so much as by, as I worked more on his thought, it became clear that his thought and his political deeds were kind of inextricably connected, so I was led to take up the one in the service of the other. Now, this chapter is actually not like that because it's about his very earliest important political statement. And at this point in his career, his political thinking was far outstripping his political acting. He was not even quite 30 years old when he wrote this, so he's rather younger than most of us who are as part of this drill. Nonetheless, it shows a fair amount of maturity of thought as well. So this chapter and the Lincoln speech that it discusses is actually particularly important for my book because here we see the appearance in a very central role, although quietly stated, in a very central role of a concept that I argue holds Lincoln's thought together into a coherent whole. At least that's the presentation of my book. And that thought is what I'm calling democratic sovereignty, sometimes also known as popular sovereignty, but I'm using this phrase to distinguish it from Stephen Douglas's version of popular sovereignty. This idea appears in his presentation of the dangers facing American perpetuation that he takes up in this speech that I'm discussing. So now, over the course of his career, however, Lincoln also returned repeatedly to one or another version of this democratic sovereignty idea, because as he saw it, it was remarkably Janus-faced in its character. On the one side, it stated what Lincoln understood to be the truth about political right, and on the basis of which just political orders like the American order could be constructed. But at the same time, he saw it to be the source of a series of dangers that threatened America, and as he said in the Gettysburg Address, of any nation so conceived and so dedicated. It was as though these true propositions of democratic sovereignty spawned their evil twins, things like the doctrine of secession. And Lincoln's task over the course of his career was to quash the evil twins while preserving the truths. That was intellectually, I think, the task that he set himself. I'm not going to say too much about my paper, actually. I had originally planned to say nothing whatever about it since the paper was sent out in advance, and I expected that people would read it. But Catherine urged me to summarize it because she said, some people may not have read it. That's what she said. I find that unlikely in this crowd of distinguished and august scholars, but it always behooves me to act in a way to please Catherine. So I'm going to say a little bit. So brief summary of my paper. My point of departure in this particular chapter is the odd structure of Lincoln's speech. It identifies a problem and it provides a solution. It then asks a second time about the problem and provides another diagnosis of it and another solution. And so the question I'm posing in a way is a literary question. What does Lincoln mean by doing this? Now, the initial problem that he discusses is what are the threats to the perpetuation of our political institutions, the main topic of his speech. The main threat that he identifies at first is lawlessness or mob rule or mobocracy, something of that sort. Now, he doesn't dwell on it, but the cause of this danger turns out to relate to the problem of democratic sovereignty, that is, to the view that political power originates with and belongs to the people. And it appears to the people, Lincoln suggests, understanding political power that way, that when they are unhappy with the way it is being exercised by their public officials, they might reclaim it and exercise it directly. That's the way he understands these mobs. And it seems to me that Lincoln's thought here was pretty well illustrated on the notorious January 6th, when the mob marching through the Capitol building chanted, our house, which fact in their mind gave them a right to take it over as they did. Now, Lincoln's solution to the problem of lawlessness is a political religion of law abidingness. That's what he says, and which would be a very good solution if it's workable. But what Lincoln shows us in the second treatment of the problem is that neither of the two humors, the great, the ambitious few, or the normal many, neither of these in society has sufficient incentive to adopt and adhere to such a political religion. Neither those ambitious few nor the ordinary, more ordinary, greedy, resentful, and envious people are likely to accept this this political religion, especially as historical time goes by, as he discusses. So Lincoln proposes then another remedy, similar yet somewhat different from the first. This one, he tells us, is thoroughly rational. We have depended on passion heretofore, but we cannot anymore. We must depend on reason alone. Now, he seems to have had in mind the rational inculcation of something like I think, the political philosophy of the liberal order. It's hard to say exactly because he doesn't really spell this out, which, if so, would get all citizens to see that law abidingness is in everyone's individual self-interest. He is remarkably reticent, however, in explaining what he's getting at in this last bit of the speech. And he leaves us wondering if the analysis that he's presented up to that point doesn't actually show us that human passion is not amenable to this kind of rational control, as he suggests at the end. The passions seem too strong. They undercut the possibility of this rational whatever it is. So I conclude that Lincoln, in fact, leaves us with a problem, but not actually a solution. Now, just one more word before I stop. As I briefly state at the end of the chapter, I believe that Lincoln in this speech has hoodwinked us a bit by pretending to offer a solution, but actually knowing and showing actually that it won't succeed. So I claim that he returned to this theme in his next major speech on temperance reform and supplied a more successful version of a solution to the problem than he does in this speech. And if any of you did go on and read that second chapter, which was included as a sort of supplementary reading, if any of you did do that, I'd be interested to know your thoughts about whether you consider that whether you would consider that a more successful version of a solution than the one in the Perpetuation Address. That's all I have, and I don't know what we do from here on, but
Well,
I'm done.
I'll just watch for people's hands, Michael, and
Okay.
when
Okay.
we're ready to go. And even you had barely started speaking, and David Fott had his hand up. So
Okay.
start with David. All right.
Thank you. Hello, Michael. Thank you
Hey,
for
David.
an interesting paper. Hi.
Hi.
You said that you're working with the concept of democratic sovereignty in Lincoln, as opposed to Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty. I wonder why you don't call it liberal sovereignty instead of democratic sovereignty, because that would seem to be more clearly compatible with Lincoln's emphasis on individual rights than the word democratic sovereignty would be.
I mean, I think that would be perfectly possible, but I had in mind, one of the things I meant to convey with that is Lincoln's notion that unlike some versions of liberalism, this notion of sovereignty culminates in, what we would easily recognize as democratic government of by and for the people. And I meant to convey that as well as the ideas of liberal sovereignty. But there's a much overlap, of course, between those two ideas. So that's the main reason. I'm not going to go to the mat over what terminology would be better for it. I chose one that seemed to be suggestive of what Lincoln was getting at. Who's going to call on people, me or you, Sue?
Sorry about that. I was muted.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Sorry,
Okay.
Lorraine. So Lorraine, you're up.
There we go. Hi, Michael. Thank you for a really interesting paper.
Hello?
I got through the first chapter and I didn't get all the way through the second chapter that you sent, so you may answer that in what I didn't get to. But I was especially intrigued by your bringing out some strands of Lincoln's thought that seemed Machiavellian, some parallels there. And I was wondering, having meditated on all of Lincoln now for some time, how close you think they ultimately are in their basic understanding of human nature and human motivations and the different human types, and if you see really important differences. And one thing that I was intrigued by was your bringing out in this first chapter the different types of ordinary people, some of whom are just motivated by a fear of punishment, but others of whom love tranquility and are disposed to law-abidingness and are motivated by a desire for the benefits of lawful order. Is that a version of Machiavellian self-interested rational thinking, or is that something else that can be built on? And that was related to some reflections about whether there's a principle that we can really be devoted to, or whether the belief in the rule of law is ultimately just a belief in our own right to do what we want to do as a people.
Yeah, good. Okay, yeah, that's a lot of questions all there. But I was struck myself by the parallels to Machiavelli that show up, I think, most especially in this early speech by Lincoln. I should say I have no evidence whatever that he ever read Machiavelli, and there are scholars of Lincoln who know infinitely more about him than I actually do, as far as like what he ever read. And of course, we have very imperfect knowledge of what he read because we just don't have good records of that sort of thing. And a lot of his reading was done when he was in his law office. He'd go over to the library at the state capitol, and we don't know exactly what he was reading when he was over there. So maybe he was reading Machiavelli for all we know. But so I'm inclined to think that it was a bit of a coincidence that he had this analysis of the two types of the great with their ambition and the ordinary people with their more petty passions. I'm likely to write that off as a kind of coincidence. But I do believe actually that there are important differences between Lincoln and Machiavelli, one of which is captured, in fact, I think by the point that you raised, which is Lincoln sees, how should we say, ordinary people to be a little more, at least potentially orderly than Machiavelli seems to do. So there are people who just are happy to have peace and order, and they'll live happily with that. And it's only when they're sort of jarred out of that situation that they become a problem for the maintenance of the regime. And another, and I think in a way a more pervasive difference that I would identify, that I do make a good deal of in the course of the book, is that is an idea that is present in the Gettysburg Address, particularly when Lincoln speaks of the a nation so dedicated. That is, the nation depends upon dedication, by which he means dedication to some principle, some moral principle that gives meaning, that people adhere to and determines their action, at least to some degree. And that, I think, is a different aspect of things than what we see in Machiavelli. So that the people, if the people are genuinely fully attached, dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal, for example, the one that he uses as an illustration here, that means accepting the moral restraint that all men are created equal implies. That is, that you're not going to treat others as slaves, for example. Lincoln thinks that that's an important resource in a political society and a possible, how should we say, a reality, a reality. And so I would say in that regard, it's not just a matter of the play of passions such as one sees in Machiavelli. There is room in Lincoln for moral, I should say, moral principle. Okay.
Okay, just so people know, because some people are chatting, letting me know. Bob Faulkner, Aline Fumaresco, Lee Ward, and Ward on that too. So Bob?
Okay, thanks. And thanks, Michael. Good to see you.
Sorry.
Oh, no, not me.
Bob Faulkner's next, Aline. So sorry about that. He's been waiting.
Okay. It's okay.
Michael.
Yeah.
That was a really fine analysis of the Perpetuation Address. And I'll have a suggestion or two, but your clarification of the two parts was really very helpful and very clear.
Thanks.
You conclude by suggesting that Lincoln leaves us at sea, that he has a big talk of rationalism, but he doesn't describe what that is. And so he leaves us with the problem of the few, especially in their danger of their domination. But I wonder if that's so. He suggests at the end that there should be general education, sound morals, and devotion to the Constitution and laws. It seems to me that it's the sound morals, that's what's analyzed in the Temperance Address.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk, I hope you do talk more about that. I too have to say I didn't finish the chapter 2.
Okay.
Secondly, as to general intelligence, the other two speeches you haven't talked about democracy generally, namely the speech on discoveries and inventions and the speech to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society, those in fact investigate the way to have general intelligence, that is to say, public education in the case of the greatest of inventions, and the kind of economy that encourages study in the case of the other. And of course, the Perpetuation Address itself addresses the third, which is encouraging reverence for law and Constitution. So I wonder whether there isn't a bit more guidance than you indicate there. And that fits with some of the things you actually just said about the Temperance Address.
Yeah. Well, that's a series of good points. I do talk about those other speeches later on. I don't want to give away too much of the book because I want you all to buy it when it's available, but what should I say? One of my themes is that Lincoln's thought, in fact, does develop. That is, in the temperance speech, he moves beyond where he was in the Perpetuation Address. In the Peoria Address, he moves beyond that and in ways that are relevant to the questions that we're discussing now. So I'm not going to be able to go through all the details of that, but nonetheless, I think there is this movement here, and the inventions or the discoveries and inventions speech, the Wisconsin Agriculture Address, those are all part of this enriching and development of his thought that I try to trace in the book. But here's my thought, and I'm a little uncertain about this, but so Lincoln first introduces the idea in the Perpetuation Address of the political religion. And the political religion is to be, how should we say, is to be fostered by, we're to swear on the blood of the revolution. That's, to summarize all of the stuff that goes on. That to me, or as I understood that, is a kind of sub-rational appeal. He's going to try to inculcate this religion on the basis of certain commitments of passion and so on, that is going to make this meaningful to the people. But the immediate sequel in the second half of the speech, he undercuts absolutely everything he said about what's going to foster and make possible that attachment to the political religion. That is for the few, very ambitious. Well, since they're trying to surpass the founders, to swear on the founders is not going to be sufficient. And for the ordinary people, their passions have been distracted from their normal bad ways by the war, by the memory of the revolution, by their hatred of the English, and so on. But these passions are fading with the fading of the memory of the revolution, the living memory of the revolution. And I took it when Lincoln first introduced the idea of a political religion. He gave us what would be required to make a political religion work. And then he gave us an analysis of why that can't be a long-term solution. In fact, one of the things I claim in the paper is that when the political religion would be possible, it wouldn't be necessary. And when it would be necessary, it would no longer be possible. That's I think the main line, the thrust of the argument at that point. Then he introduces out of left field this whole new thing created out of rational materials only. And it's, interesting to me, he gives us so little actual way to understand what he's getting at there. And so I took that to mean he's whistling, walking past the graveyard. He doesn't actually have an answer to that question. In the Temperance Address, he
Hello?
Yeah, so other people are losing Michael. Michael, I don't know if you can hear us, but I think we're losing you. This is
Sure, I'd like to follow up if I may with one.
certainly, yeah, if we
Yeah.
can.
he does that.
If Michael's alive.
We missed you.
There he is.
Better?
People can't hear you.
Can't
Hi.
hear me?
No,
There you are. Now we hear you.
I don't know.
We were losing you.
I'm just not used to
Now you can hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Now, yeah, okay.
Michael,
What's
may I follow up with one point?
Yeah. Well, how far did I go before you stopped hearing me?
I think we heard you.
Okay.
Doesn't the end of that speech show the importance of the orator, of rhetoric, and in particular of sympathetic rhetoric? It does it in part by the kinds of bombastic exaggerations that you call attention to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in a
Well,
way,
go ahead.
this genius is anticipating the other three speeches that is necessary, that he or people who are moved by his kind of talk are crucial. In other words, liberal orators, very liberal rhetoric is very important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I would argue that, in fact, the appeal to pure reason alone kind of speaks against the idea of rhetoric. Rhetoric appeals not merely to pure reason, and that it's later on especially at the time of the Peoria Address, that Lincoln comes to make room for an appeal that's not purely rational. In fact, an appeal, well, I mean, not to go into detail, but an appeal that does leave more room for rhetoric rather than just, like rational argumentation. So I would say I'm not so sure that this speech is quite as mature as you're wanting to read it.
Okay, Aline, you're up now.
Aline, how are you?
I'm fine, trying to figure out all these technicalities here.
You're good now, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, first of all, for the people who haven't read the second chapter, that's a shame, because I think that was quite amazing. I never thought about how you can move from the temperance speech to where you moved it, but it's great. And it's a great writing. Like, let me read just the ending of the chapter. The solution outlined in the temperance address, in effect, freed Lincoln to be Lincoln. That's beautiful. Now, enough praises now. I was curious, when did you write these chapters? Because they seem like be written yesterday or something like that. But okay, let me finish, because I have like 3 questions. So that's the first one. The second one is, when you label Lincoln as a moderate progressive, is this a nicer way of saying he's a conservative a la Burke? Because Burke said without conservation, without change, no conservation, it's possible. So I've seen some quite interesting similarities, and I was wondering, why not use the word conservative and pick the word moderate, progressive? And the final question is, when I read the second chapter on temperance, I was wondering if you gave any thoughts to Plato's laws, where the entire dialogue basically starts with the discussion about drinking and drunkenness.
Good. Yeah. Well, to take your last question first. Well, see, in my family, we have a division of labor. And my wife deals with Plato's laws, and I hardly do. So I don't think I was thinking of it at that time. But I can't give you a good, clear answer to that, because actually, to take your first question first, I wrote these chapters 5 or 6 years ago, or maybe even longer ago than that. I've been struck by the same fact you mentioned, which is there's something about these chapters in particular that resonate very much with the present moment. In fact, I published an article adapting my chapter in the journal National Affairs, in which I talk about the temperance address and Lincoln's thought there, and connect it more specifically to Trump and populism and all the issues of our time. So it strikes me as a very sort of a natural question. But I did really read it, wrote this whole thing well before any of this broke out. So it tells you something about Lincoln, his prescience. He's seeing something important about politics that pops up every once in a while, As far as the conservative Burke, I think Lincoln is more progressive than Burke was, or at least than I understand Burke to be. I think that Lincoln, what I have in mind is that Lincoln actually saw that there were implications of the, let's call it the Declaration's philosophy, that we were not yet aware of, and that those implications were probably more, let's say, transformative of society than say a Burke, I think, would be willing to concede. So, I mean, among other things, again, I'm not quite sure what Burke would say about this, but Lincoln early on talks about women's suffrage. I mean, he was very open to talking about that. He then, suppressed it because it wasn't germane to what his agenda through most of his career. But nonetheless, this was something he was thinking about as quite a young man. And if you read the Temperance Address, he seems open to really considering a variety of these reform movements that were popping up in 19th century America, and especially the anti-slavery movement. I mean, that was one he was clearly concerned with. So I think he's more progressive in a real sense than Burke was, but moderate. He's not buying into everything that people were thinking about at that time.
Lee Ward.
Thanks, Sue. Hi, Michael.
Hello, Lee. Good to see you. Hear from you. Where are you now? I've lost you.
Hopefully, I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Yeah. Okay, good.
Thank you for the chapters. They were great. I really enjoyed them. I like the bunk beds too, by the way. That's kind of neat.
Phil Molino used to make a joke that I'm doing this from my dorm room.
I guess what I would like to do is, if you can help me situate these early speeches in sort of the bigger Lincoln project. You mentioned as we see the issue of slavery is in the background in both the Temperance but especially the Perpetuation. But you made an interesting observation. You said it's striking that it's not more explicitly. It's not foregrounded in the way you might expect it. So I guess I'd reframe my question in this way. Is it surprising that equality as a concept is not more explicitly foregrounded and centered in these early speeches, especially when we consider later Lincoln is quite clear that all men are created equal is the touchstone of his entire philosophy and everything he intends to do. In these early speeches, it seems like the problem of freedom can be dealt with, or he's exploring if it can be dealt with on the level of freedom. So that like rational self-control is a kind of expression of your freedom to overcome a problem of freedom. And then we don't get a discussion, we don't get the kind of discussion of the moral meaning of equality that we get later with Lincoln. So I guess my question would be, in these early speeches, is Lincoln still struggling to find a way to talk about equality, a kind of idiom for equality, or does he evolve? Does as he deepens and thinks more about the question of slavery, the problem of slavery, does he come to a fuller understanding of equality later on, so that these early speeches, it's a work in progress, I suppose?
The short answer is yes, I think. So for example, the Declaration doesn't really have a role in these early speeches. It comes to have a role in the mid 1850s, and especially I'd say around the Peoria Address is where we see the Declaration rise to prominence in Lincoln's thinking. And with the Declaration, I mean, a bunch of things happen together. Slavery becomes his agenda, and he sets as his mission to put slavery on the national agenda. And he has this very, I think, important speech. It's one of the speeches that the scholars always ignore. There are a bunch of Lincoln speeches that the scholars tend to dismiss. The Discoveries and Inventions speech, which Bob Faulkner mentioned, is one of those. His Wisconsin agriculture speech is another. I mean, Lincoln as an expert on agriculture doesn't strike us as a likely topic. And his eulogy on Henry Clay is another one. This is often dismissed as not a really important speech. I, on the other hand, see that eulogy as very important and a significant step in Lincoln's thinking, in that it's there that Lincoln makes clear that the need for the new generation of American leader. Like Clay, the death of Clay is the moment when the second generation of American leaders after the founders have passed from the scene, basically. So what's the task for the third generation, in effect, to which Lincoln himself belongs, Douglas belongs, et cetera? And what Lincoln insists on is that great a man as Clay was, he made a point of keeping slavery off the national agenda because he saw it as a threat to the Union, and he was willing to constantly compromise on the slavery issue in order to save the Union. And what I argue in that speech is that Lincoln is announcing there, no, we need to put slavery on the national agenda, and we need, therefore, this is something that may, at least I argue, that may arouse some disagreement, but Lincoln was willing to put the Union at risk in a way that Clay and others were not, because Lincoln saw that the degree to which they were trying to save the Union was the degree to which they were allowing slavery to entrench itself ever more deeply into the Union, such that the threat of an all-slave nation was a real reality by the end of the 1850s. So that's the point. So it's at that point when Lincoln comes to prioritize slavery and want to get it on the national agenda, that he also adopts the Declaration as his central rhetorical appeal. And at the same time, then the all men are created equal theme rises in prominence in his thinking. But I also believe that he didn't see equality and freedom as drastically opposed to each other. I think he saw them as very closely connected, even in that later period. So, but there is definitely a shift in his, not merely in his rhetoric, but I think in his thinking towards the Declaration.
Ann Ward.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Michael. Thank you for your wonderful chapters.
Thank
And
you,
my
Ann.
question, thank you. And my question has to do with chapter 1, and it's more of a speculative question.
Uh-huh.
But I noticed, in the third, as you divide the speech, the third part of the speech, when Lincoln is speaking about the few and the many, and you argue that he believed that the ambitions of the few were attached to the success of the regime whereby that can show that a people are capable of ruling themselves. They're attached to that because the success of it meant they would be immortalized through their names going on to towns, cities. And so I guess my question was, and you say his analysis of the great is similar to Machiavelli's analysis of the great, especially founders. And I guess my question had more to do, I guess, what you think Lincoln would think of the current movement to reverse that, not through mobocracy, but through law, through legal measures, to take the names of founders, or even Lincoln himself, but especially off the names of cities, libraries, buildings, which I think is a very, would Lincoln see this as inevitable in a democracy, democratic? Would he see it as inevitable?
Yeah. Well, there's actually,
is it getting prepared for a new founding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's a good question, and I happen to address it. not exactly in those terms, but in the Temperance Address, Lincoln Lincoln presents an analysis in which the thing that catches most attention in the Temperance Address is the contrast he draws between the new reformers, that is, these Washingtonian temperance reformers, and the old reformers, the people who denounced drink. And that gets a lot of attention from readers of the speech, but also Lincoln gives it a lot of attention in the speech. But as the speech goes on, he raises another question that's really, I think, more interesting, which is to say, those so-called old reformers are only 20 years old or so. They're not very old. And what Lincoln leads us to see is that the whole idea of temperance reform, the whole idea of trying to really control the role of alcohol in society, is completely new. I mean, on either old or new reformers. And he raises the question, why did that emerge when, as far back as Noah, we've had drink, and as he says, people used to think of it as the abuse of a very good thing. They didn't think of it as a bad thing, as something to be done away with. And so he's then led to reflect on, what is the meaning of the emergence of this reform mentality? That's the thing I think, at least as I read it, that's the most important thing in the speech, the emergence of the reform mentality, the idea that there's much more can be done with regard to human taking charge of human society and of human life. And so he traces the emergence of this idea, interestingly, to the American Revolution, of all things. But so the American Revolution proved that people can govern themselves, that the people can govern themselves. That is, that human beings have enough freedom to get hold of their own life and control it in a way that overturns the kind of passivity that had been dominant before. So one of the things, though, that Lincoln wants to say is that the future possibilities of reform, of change, more changes than we've seen, those future possibilities depend upon keeping alive the original impetus to this reform, which was the political reform that the American Revolution represented. That is, we need to recall always, that's the beginning point of this movement towards reform. And so, among other things, he has an idea that he uses in the rest of his career, of the need for maintaining reverence for the founding. Even as one needs to go beyond the founding, one needs to maintain reverence for the founding. And so I think Lincoln, he might, I don't know, we used to live in Minnesota, where there, in the middle of Minneapolis, there's a lake, well-known lake, very large lake, called Lake Calhoun. Oh. And now, perhaps Lincoln would be approving. They moved. Apparently, they've changed the name of that lake in more recent times. Perhaps Lincoln would approve of that, because Calhoun maybe doesn't deserve, because of his role with regard to slavery, he doesn't deserve a lot of honor. But the idea of removing George Washington's name, the idea of removing Lincoln's own name, the idea of removing, no, he would not approve of that, I don't think. No. I'm almost certain of it. But for reasons related to his own principles, he had a sort of deep theory about it. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I said in my chat, I hope no one's has any plans for tonight, because we have a long list. I thought I'd read. Zach German, Brian Garston, Sam Piccolo, Mark Landy, Max Smith, Beth Lowry Bay, Walt Nagorski, Sebastian Graham, and Anna Marissa, just so you have some sense of where you are in the list.
Okay. What time do we end here?
Pardon me?
I said, what time we finished?
Midnight.
We might,
midnight, okay.
We might want to go get a drink.
Okay.
The temperance address. So okay. Yeah, Zach, you're up.
Okay. Thanks, Sue. Michael, unsurprisingly, I was simply nodding along for most of both chapters.
Not nodding off, I hope.
No, absolutely not. All right. But I did have a few quick questions about the Perpetuation Address that I wanted to hear your thoughts on. So the first question is with respect to your analysis of the role of slavery in the Perpetuation Address, and I was surprised that you did not make use of the line where Lincoln says that lawless action springs up, quote, among the pleasure-hunting masters of Southern slaves and the order-loving citizens of the land of steady habits. Because I think that's a really revealing line, that even as he's saying it's a problem everywhere, he also seems to be indicating that slave societies are particularly vulnerable to allowing passion to supplant lawful processes. And thus that he may be suggesting that though this is a problem for democratic societies generally, maybe there are cultural preconditions that can either alleviate or exacerbate this tendency in democratic society. So my first question is whether you would agree with that kind of reading of that line in the speech. My second question is whether you are too kind on behalf of Lincoln towards the towering geniuses in both chapters, where you say Lincoln does not mean to say these are evil people. because they are, if the opportunity is there, they're just as willing to make their name, perhaps more so to make their name by doing good rather than evil. But I'm not convinced that that actually exonerates anyone to say, if the opportunity's there, I'll do good to do something historic. But if the opportunity's not there, then I'm going to turn to doing something evil because I've got to do what I've got to do to be a historic figure. So I wondered whether that was more neutral or even more positive to them than Lincoln actually is, and whether Lincoln is further separated from those characters. Because my argument would be that Lincoln would not be willing to do evil if he had to in order to make a name for himself.
Okay.
And then my last question, my last question, then I'll stop, is about the conclusion of the speech. And I think this may pick up on Professor Faulkner's comment about rhetoric. I wonder whether Lincoln, even though he says he wants cool, calculating reason as a solution, whether he's actually departing from his political religion as much as he says he is at the end of the speech. Because as soon as he says we need to rely upon reason because we can't rely upon passions any longer, then he starts talking about the resurrection of George Washington, the last Trump that will awaken Washington. And he starts talking about how the American project is second only to the Christian church. So it seems like he's making a pretty political religion type appeal at the very end of the speech, a passionate appeal, an evocative appeal, even as he has just said we need to turn to cold reason rather than passion. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about his rhetorical flourish at the very end.
Okay. So with regard to the first question about the Perpetuation Address, I may have in an earlier draft of that chapter talked about that very sentence that you cite. I don't recall exactly, but I did edit that chapter down substantially, and I think the substance of that I summarized along with some other things. So, but I would definitely agree with the general point you're making that slavery, there's a background culture that exacerbates the problem. I thought I actually said something like that kind of explicitly, that it's the combination really of the democratic sovereignty plus the problem of slavery that's particularly problematical in America, because slavery gives occasion for the energizing of the sovereignty position. So yes, I would definitely agree with you there. With regard to the towering geniuses, well, one of the things I argue in the book is that Lincoln did see himself as one of these. He was tremendously, strangely ambitious for a guy who came out of nowhere and lived in a small town in Illinois. It's amazing to me that he had such big thoughts about himself in that kind of setting. Usually it takes a big setting to think big thoughts, but he did. So one of the differences between the Perpetuation Address and the Temperance Address, I believe, is that it was in the Temperance Address that Lincoln came to see that there was a job for towering geniuses which didn't involve overturning the regime of the founders or overturning the republic. There was a task which was in effect extending the principles of the regime into new areas, which could achieve for the one who does it the kind of fame that the towering geniuses seek, and which I believe Lincoln actually did seek. But that was good because it allowed him, as Aline quoted earlier, it allowed him to be Lincoln. That is, it allowed him to attach his desire to do good with his desire to be a very famous person. And so, because he could now generate a project which would combine those two things. But at the time of the Perpetuation Address, it isn't clear to me he saw that possibility.
But just a quick follow-up, do you think that Lincoln saw himself as someone who would have enslaved freemen if that would have been the only?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. But I think that he would have been caught in a bind. Like, if that's, so I want this kind of fame, but how, if I can only get it by doing it, I mean, I don't know what he would have ultimately done. but I think he saw a path that would allow him to do both. But it was still, in his version of it, a very risky path, a path that could have led to disaster, both personally for him. I mean, if you think about it, the election of 1864, which he thought he was going to lose, if he had lost that election, he was certain that the Union would surrender, that the South would go its own way, slavery would be preserved, and he would be known as the person who had lost the Union. I mean, that would not be achieving fame, but it was, it's a big gamble. And so indicates he was on a path that was in fact very, very risky. Okay, so for your third question, well, it seems to me that the political religion that he called for in the first part of the speech depended upon the appeal to the revolution. It depended for the few, it depended upon their ability to satisfy their ambition via the achievement of what the revolution achieved, that is the establishment of a free republic, self-government, etc. And for the many, it depended upon the turning outward of the negative passions that people have against the British, and a kind of enlistment maybe in the project of a republic as well. And therefore, he's now, by the time he comes to the very end of the speech, he's already discredited this. He says, well, those things aren't going to work. So it isn't clear what this appeal to, the risen George Washington can possibly mean at this point. To me, it's a tip-off that he's just, he's in orbit, or maybe even out of orbit by that time. So that's the way I read that. I mean, that just reads, I think it reads very falsely, the end of the speech. I just, like the end of the temperance address as well. They're both Lincoln at his worst. I think those are the two worst pieces of writing he ever did.
Brian.
Hi, everyone.
Brian. Well, Brian.
Hi. I learned an awful lot from this pair of chapters, and I was really glad to read them. I found myself thinking about this question of reform, and what it is to perpetuate institutions when you also think of them as part of an unfinished experiment, as you emphasize at the end of the second chapter. And I found myself thinking about the kind of zeal for justice that characterized some of the reform movements. And I wonder if you could just give a sense of how you think Lincoln saw that kind of political emotion. So it's a little bit different from the ambition, different from the envy and avarice that you talk about. It's this particular, I guess, sort of religious zeal for justice. And Lincoln seems to me not to share in it, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you see him trying to respond to it and manage it.
Good question. As he looked out over the world, especially once he had formulated anti-slavery as his agenda, he saw maybe three kinds of people. One kind were the people who had, let's say, less than zeal for justice, the people who wanted to preserve slavery and were going to do what it took to do that. Then there was the main bulk of the people who seemed kind of lukewarm about the whole process. And then there were the abolitionists. And I think he saw the abolitionists as the people you're talking about, the people with a real zeal for reform. And I think he had some sympathy for them, no question. I think he had way more sympathy for the abolitionists than a lot of his rhetoric let on. But on the other side, I think he saw that they were foolish. I mean, they didn't have enough sense of what they ought to be doing to achieve their goals. And I think he would have said, you know, they're being misled a little bit by their zeal. Their zeal has, so the idea of no union with slaveholders, I mean, that's like the dumbest policy one could possibly pursue. If your goal is doing away with slavery, that's the exact you know, that's not going to produce that result. So, and likewise with some of the he has an analysis in the Temperance Address of the so-called old reformers, in which they had a certain zeal for reform, which led ultimately to, and maybe it's the same mechanism as with the abolitionists. The zealous reformers began by trying to get the drinkers to reform themselves. But when they didn't reform themselves, the zealous reformers turned against the drinkers and wanted to expel them from society, in effect. And it's as though the zealotry leads to a kind of frustration, which then turns against the job, just as no union with slaveholders does the same. So maybe that's, I mean, I don't have a real analysis of that. I mean, it's a good point. Maybe I'm not going to at this point add it, but I mean, that's a good theme. I think that would be worth talking about. Why Lincoln was a more moderate person than the zealous reformers. Yeah, I don't know. Is that getting at what you were interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I just thought the pair of chapters raised that question nicely, and I guess and the resonances with questions coming up today were in my mind as well, as Alain mentioned.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Sam Piccolo.
Hi, Michael.
Hello, Sam. How are you doing?
Pretty good. How about you?
Good. Doing well. Thank you.
So my question is about your point in the second chapter where you contrast innovators to Caesars. And so it has two parts, but they're connected. So it's really just one question. And one is as a historical fact. Are you completely comfortable with saying that these figures are innovators and not something more? I'm not an American historian, and in fact, not even American, although my mother, I think, increasingly fears that I'm becoming one. But it does seem to me that the powers that Lincoln had to claim in order to innovate were quite extreme, constitutionally speaking, and perhaps stress the boundaries of innovation, you know, basically inventing war powers, suspending habeas corpus, defying the Chief Justice. And then Franklin Roosevelt, who you mentioned, certainly had plans for the Supreme Court that would have gone beyond innovation and which merely by threatening them seemed to have made somewhat of a difference. And then there's Lyndon Johnson, who you don't mention, but who is the president or statesman who achieved politically the sorts of promises that Martin Luther King, who you do mention, achieved socially. And Johnson also strikes me as a figure at least slightly more forceful than an innovator too, though I guess I'm hoping that Robert Caro stays alive long enough to write the fifth volume so I can find out that. And so second and connected to this, what do you think about the argument that sees these moments of innovation, to use your term, as a sort of tragedy, with each new founding, each new innovation, creating a new constitution that addresses failings of previous ones, but which contradicts the old ones in some ways, and then leaves different parts of the country operating under different constitutions, which are not entirely compatible, and then creates the sort of civic dissolution we have today?
Well, much of what you're asking, of course, Lincoln had no opinions about. You know, like, did Martin Luther King go beyond being an innovator towards something more than that? Just to address this question with regard to Lincoln himself, I argue in my book, and this is bound to be one of the more controversial parts of it, that in fact, on the big constitutional questions, Lincoln was right, and that his critics are wrong. That Lincoln was correct about habeas corpus, and Lincoln was correct about emancipation. But that's an argument that, you know, you'll have to read the details to appreciate and judge whether you think it's true or not. I suppose, and I think this is true. I mean that these innovators, there's no guarantee that the innovators are going to preserve everything that should be preserved. I guess that's, I mean, that I take it is the ultimate point of your question. Do they go beyond the standing regime in acceptable or proper ways? Is it just an extension, or is it also an undermining of the going regime? Yes, is that a fair way to get at it? I think the answer is, yeah, I guess that can happen. Politics is risky, and the policies that Lincoln was open to seem to me to be risky. He himself, I think, tried to set a model. I think he did accept the fact that the Constitution did set limitations on him that he did accept, in fact. And so maybe he hoped that would serve as a model for other of these innovators. Yeah, I mean, it'd be a debatable discussion. So did Franklin Roosevelt, in proposing the court packing plan, unacceptably go beyond the Constitution that was? That's a good question. I don't have I mean, I'd have to think about that a little bit before I had a good answer to it. But so I think Lincoln's policy, I mean, to try to give us a brief, yes, there was a risk of this sort of thing, but I'm not sure there's a necessity for it, if that makes sense.
That's good. And there's a long list of questions, but when you're back in Chicago, perhaps we can get together.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. We come and have lunch. Yeah. Now that at least we're vaccinated. I don't know about the rest of you. Yeah.
The hell with us.
Landy, you're next.
I want to join the chorus of people who loved both chapters. And I want to add a tiny thing and then ask you a question that very much, I think, follows from Brian's question. We have to congratulate Lincoln for inventing Alcoholics Anonymous. I mean, he understood it. And of course, that's how prescient he was. But my question, in a way, does have to do with his prescience. And it's about the sort of progressive Lincoln that you put forward in the second chapter. Mm-hmm. And you so rightly say that he bases any zeal for reform on a reverence for the Constitution and the liberal political order. I think that's entirely correct. But as I look, the reform movements, the biggest ones, have tended to go in the direction of the old temperance, not the new temperance. And is he sufficiently aware of that strong possibility that moderate reform, which so many of us adore, has not a very good history?
Well, of course, he was writing without all of our historical experience, so that's, it's not entirely clear what he could anticipate or not. But however, he was working at a time, writing at a time. As you may remember, I begin that chapter by citing Emerson's essay on the reform movements of that time. And so, I mean, there was reform movement for about everything one could imagine. And so Lincoln was no doubt aware of immoderate, imprudent, stupid reform ideas. And as the subtitle of that chapter is "Playing with Fire," and I mean, I think Lincoln understood this is playing with fire. This is the fate of this regime to dabble with that sort of thing, and it might be a source of good, but it might be a source of bad. And yeah, I think he just was willing, or I mean, maybe it isn't his willingness. It's just that's the way the world is, and that's the possibility that exists. I mean, he thought he was analyzing something that was out there, not that he was inventing it or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, I think he was counting on political leadership arising that would be able to distinguish between sensible reform ideas and crazy ones.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
Matt. Max, you're muted.
Max,
There you are.
there he is. Hi, Max.
You're still muted. Max, we can't hear you.
How about now?
There you are. Now we hear you.
Yes, okay. And it's brought back fond memories of the Lincoln course when we were able to meet in person. I suppose the conclusion of the second chapter left me wondering whether there was a problem with temperament in this solution you propose in the end of the second chapter to the problem of the ambitious few, and whether the kind of moderate progressivism that you outline in Lincoln's speech appeals to the kind of person who he fears or he is, that wishes to make this great name for themselves and to change things so fundamental, and to change things. And if that's the case, whether it's only a solution that can fit somebody with the peculiar temperament that Lincoln has, where he's both very ambitious but also so mournful and depressive at times. And
is that it?
So do you think there's an issue with if the solution that's outlined here only can appeal to a person with a very particular kind of temperament, or if there's a general solution that can reach past that?
Well, I think he saw, I mean, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I mean, I think he saw that the emergence of men of ambition that was maybe a little great, you know, people who want to do something more than be a two-term president, let's say, you know, people who want to be more than Benjamin Harrison or, you know, others we might identify as major presidential figures, that men like that will arise from time to time, and that the possibility that he mentions as implicit in the character of the regime, that there would be people who would rise to want to fill that position. So I guess the answer is yes, there would be such men of temperament, and he thought they would emerge.
But I mean, whether the solution you outline can appeal to those men. Are those people?
You don't think so?
I just wonder whether the temperament that drives somebody to desire to achieve so much is compatible with a moderate progressivism, or whether he thinks there's some tension there. That's like Machiavelli, who you bring up a few times, says that the hard thing in this kind of reform moment is having the person who's willing to go so far, but also has the values and the temperament to do so in a way that's appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think people like Lincoln himself, you know, I think Lincoln himself in a way is the best example of the kind of person he's talking about. But a Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, I think a Franklin Roosevelt did what, you know, he did a great thing. You know, you could say he saved capitalism. He did, you know, one could characterize it different ways, but he did a great thing. He won great fame. Martin Luther King is another example that I use. You know, the case here, the hard case, what about Trump? There was somebody who seemed to be wanting to overturn the regime. And Lincoln probably wouldn't, well, I don't want to get too partisan, but I mean, I don't think he'd necessarily approve of Trump. So I think the answer is, yeah, I think the answer is yes, actually, but maybe not everybody who would respect those limits. And I guess that's the example that Trump gives. And there you hope that the constitutional system will, in fact, restrain them.
Okay, I hate to do this for people that are so patient. Just so you know, we have about 15 minutes left and 5 people on the queue. So take that as you will.
Hi, I probably read them in the wrong order. I read your chapter first on the Lyceum Address. And then when I read the Lyceum Address, I profoundly agreed with your interpretation of it. Okay. I don't know if it would have been the same thing if I had done it the other way, the proper way, the other way around. But this is what I found really interesting about reading your interpretation, is that I almost felt like I was reading an account of how Lincoln was reaching the limits of politics and trying to transform from like a political conception of reason as something that was useful for practical political life to a conception of reason that can be more Socratic in that it's discovering the truth of first principles. And because the turn to like the need for religious, a political religion seemed to be very much like in the tradition of Isocrates, where you have an established set or group of rulers who have a certain agreement among them that can keep that unity of the regime perpetuating over time. But with the, now we have a system of government which has multiple elements integrated into it and multiple interests, and then multiple doctrines and multiple interpretations of doctrines. And it seemed like that he's recognizing that problem that's raised, which is that unless we're just going to assert that they're essentially contested and try to balance them against each other, then they're just going to be, you're in a perpetual contest. So is there a way to show with reason, coming to the next part of your article, to demonstrate like the truth of any one of them? And then it's almost like you can see the Civil War then, like his turn to the Declaration of Independence as this kind of like more like Socratic, rigorous, logical approach almost, where he's like taking the first premise, which seems to be most founded, and then applying like a very rigorous principle of non-contradiction to it. To rather than it's like the South against the North and those two interpretations against each other, he takes a first principle and then shows how we cannot allow that to be manifest in practice in a self-contradictory way. I don't know. My question is that does that seem like anything on the right track, or am I going off track with that? Or do you see that kind of striving in Lincoln towards a philosophic conception of reason?
Yes, in my fifth chapter, I try to lay out. The fifth chapter, in my opinion, is a very important chapter in the book because I try to lay out there two things which are significant. One, his argument, a first principles argument, why so example, the argument, what the core of his argument against slavery actually is, which is not the same as what he said in public all the time. So that's one. And then second, the main content of his theory of statesmanship that I think can be applied, or that I try to apply anyway, to what he actually did as he went on later. So the fifth chapter is actually centering around the Peoria Address and other things that he was saying and thinking at around that time. So I think the answer is yes, he was, I think he was reaching towards those first, if you want to call them first principles, I think he was reaching towards those. And that's in that chapter, I try to lay out as best I can what I think he came to with regard to those matters. Okay, I mean, it'd be complicated to try to explain.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Walt, you're next.
Yeah.
Hello there. Hi.
Hi, Walt.
Michael, thank you for sharing with us this glimpse into your work on Lincoln. Appreciate that very much. And if you're getting tired, I just remind you that you invented this format for our political theory colloquium at Notre Dame. So you should be put through it now.
Okay.
So thank you for so much. But I wanted to draw attention to and maybe get a little more reflection from you on the interesting observation you make early in the first chapter when you say there's something kind of tragic, and I don't know if I didn't reread the Perpetuation Address. I don't know how much of that is you and how much Lincoln, but something tragic about the confidence that has been built in the idea of government of the people. And then you illustrated that in part by what the January 6th incidents where people were invading the Capitol and saying it's our house. And so I'm interested in the tension between that first principle just alluded to, that we so often see in the founding debates, that there's a first principle of the revolution that has to be preserved. And then, of course, that Lincoln writes this speech just a few years before Tocqueville sets foot here, and seems to run into some of the same Jacksonian spiritedness, populism. And so that the tension between that first principle and orderly government or just government, was there any kind of interaction in any form, say Tocqueville having any sense? He probably didn't even have any sense that Lincoln existed out there at that time. But what about Lincoln with respect to Tocqueville's statements about, I know again, he didn't read him probably, but the advancing idea of equality and in tension with liberty. So do you have any further comment on that cluster of things?
Well, I haven't run across myself evidence of Lincoln's knowing Tocqueville. So, I mean, that doesn't prove it isn't there. There are, as I said earlier, there are people like Alan Gelso who knows, every shopping list that Lincoln ever made, that sort of thing, which I don't. So possibly he read Tocqueville, but I have no evidence that he did. So I think Lincoln had a different view of this, though, than Tocqueville. So Tocqueville thought the problem was the ever expanding notion of equality, but Lincoln thought that opinion was moving in the other direction, that the commitment to equality was far less in 1858 or 1857 at the time of the Dred Scott, was far less than it had been at the time of the founding. And so he saw the possibility of what we would, a reversion to a less egalitarian world. And so Lincoln didn't actually have quite the same kind, it's interesting, there's an interesting parallel. I wrote the conclusion to the book not too long ago, and I in fact drew a brief parallel between Tocqueville and Lincoln on the issue of progress, if you will. So Tocqueville has this pretty, I don't want to say deterministic, that's a little too strong, but still, a firm theory of progress. We're moving towards equality, and that's the way history is going, and he tries to develop the mechanism that might make that work. And Lincoln, in his address on discoveries and inventions, has also a kind of account of how the development of, in this case, technology really, through history has led to the emergence of the idea of equality. But Lincoln's version of it is less deterministic and more dependent on human opinion, so to speak, than Tocqueville's. And so Lincoln has more room for the idea of backsliding, or that this process can go the other way. And at least in my analysis of the House Divided speech, I read this in a more pessimistic way than it usually is done. That I think Lincoln saw the, he says we face the choice, a nation, half slave and half free, and has to become one or the other. And I think he saw easy path to become all slave, but he didn't see an easy path to become all free. And it seemed to me that if we keep going as we're going, we're going to become all slave way before we become all free. And so the idea of serious backsliding, that seemed to be something he took seriously. So I guess that's how I'd see him and Tocqueville related to each other with regard to especially the theme of the progress of equality in the modern world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes, and we have 3 people on the queue: Sebastian, Anna, and Dana. And I wondered if you put your questions on the table, and then Michael can. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
So that we can questions on the table.
Okay. Okay.
So Sebastian, and then Anna, and then Dana.
Okay, I'll try to make this brief. Doesn't the concern for reason, especially, this is kind of harkening back to previous discussions, but doesn't this concern for reason and popular sovereignty and lead us in a way back to rhetoric? And I particularly have in mind Churchill's remarks about the United States in his piece, The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. Thanks.
Okay.
Anna?
Yes, thank you, Professor Collins. So to keep this really short, in your first chapter, you show that Lincoln considers slavery to be a particular evil precisely because it exacerbates some of these inherent dangers in any regime founded on popular sovereignty. Namely, sort of what you refer to as mob rule, or more broadly, the desire of the people to take some of that power back from representative institutions and to carry that out themselves. And so I was wondering, for Lincoln, what is it precisely about the issue of slavery, as compared to other grave political and moral questions, that makes it function as a catalyst for sort of mob activity or extra representative activity? And then in particular, depending on your answer, is some of that catalyst something that we've also witnessed sort of in political activity of that kind over the last couple of months?
Okay.
And Dana.
Hi, yeah, just quickly, Lincoln seemed to take a different view from that of Tocqueville on the issue of ambition and what the fate of ambition would be in the modern era. And I just wondered if you think that that's right, that they did see it quite differently, and why they might have seen the matter differently, the fate of ambition.
Okay. Let me go up. I'll start with Dana and move to Sebastian. How's that? So I think Tocqueville and Lincoln differed with some of their basic categories of social analysis, if I can sound like a social scientist for a minute. So Tocqueville had this idea of social state, which in his mind was extremely determinative of what people were able to even think of, to conceive of, the way they would be shaped as persons. And therefore, I think Tocqueville saw that the equality of conditions that he refers to would lead to a kind of lowering of the bar of ambition. That ambition would become ever pettier, so to speak. Lincoln didn't have a theory like that. I mean, for better or for worse, he didn't have a theory like that. So he thought that something like the ambition was a matter of human nature, that there was something, there would be people would pop up who had much greater ambition, and that wouldn't be suppressed by a social situation as Tocqueville seemed to think it would be. So that's, at least I believe, the difference between them on that. With regard to slavery and the way it exacerbates the problem, so what I argue very briefly in that chapter is something like this. Slavery was a controversial topic in the American regime, and was a controversial topic because it was at odds with the basic commitment to, natural rights, equality, and so on. And as a controversial topic, it provided basis for dissatisfaction for almost everybody with the way it was being handled. So the slave owners never thought they were getting enough protection for their slavery, and therefore they were generally, so I take for example, the Mississippi gamblers example in the Perpetuation Address. So finally, they start by hanging gamblers. Well, why were the people against gambling? Well, I think the answer I give actually greater length in this article that I published in National Affairs was something like this. So I'm guessing the people of Mississippi were probably Baptists. And Baptists don't like gambling. But the legislature had gone ahead and licensed gambling, and probably, as was very common in the 19th century, probably there was, you know, some sort of payoff to somebody in order to produce that license. And so the people thought that their representatives had kind of sold them out, and they then took action on their own against the gamblers because it was contrary to their deep moral commitments. But then one thing led to another, and so they started to hang black people. They started to hang white people who were helping, who they thought were helping black people. And that was an expression of the fact that in the South, because of slavery, there was a constant fear of slave uprisings, of abolitionists fomenting slave uprisings. And so it's an easy thing for there to be a sense of dissatisfaction among pro-slavery people. You're never doing enough. You're never doing enough for us. You're never doing enough to make us feel really secure. And likewise, on the other side, there were all kinds of vigilante action against the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause. Because here's the Fugitive Slave Clause. Here are people trying to enforce the actual law, but there's the surrounding society is considering that law tremendously unjust. And so they have a sense of grievance against the authorities surrounding the issue of slavery that leads them to want to take the law into their own hands. And so slavery is a constant, just, you know, kind of gets people riled up. The third question about Churchill's remarks, I just don't know what Churchill's remarks were, so I'm not sure. I can't really respond to that. Maybe you can you tell me what his remark was?
So he refers to the United States as thinking themselves so educated to not fall to the appeals of rhetoric, but that being like the most clever trick of rhetoric.
Well, I think Lincoln didn't believe for a minute that the people of the United States didn't fall to rhetoric. No, I think they, at least later in his more mature thought. It depends how seriously you take his appeal to reason, pure reason, at the end of the Temperance Address. I'm sorry, at the end of the Perpetuation Address. So I think he would probably agree with, so far as people thought they were not succumbing to rhetoric, he might agree with Churchill on there that, that's not what was happening. So.
If I was just allow one more follow-up, wouldn't this be like the most demagogic move to make the audience think they were being reasonable, though, to kind of,
Well, I mean, it might be if Lincoln were, used it to some purpose, but he didn't at this point, and he actually never actually does, or at least that I can think of. So, yeah. All right.
All right. Well, we are past time, and I thank you very much, Michael. I think you've proven once again that you should have never retired from Notre Dame.
Really?
Enjoyed this with both Elysian and
being down here in Arizona, I wish I could show you what it's like outside and how fantastic it is here.
Michael, there's no.
We can see the reflection in behind Zach in the window, and that's been fantastic.
Okay, yeah, that's it exactly. So.
Thank you so much for this.
Well, thank you all. It's been really fun.
Yeah, and all the participants.
Great to see you all.
Questions, and Alex Duff, who found the Zoom room for us. So
Alex, thank you for that.
I don't know who's next on our colloquium list, but hope to see everybody back when.
Jeff Nelson, isn't he?
I missed that, Michael.
Jeff Nelson, didn't I hear that somewhere?
I think Eric Nelson is for the.
Oh, Eric Nelson. I mean, yeah, sorry, yeah, Eric Nelson.
There's many overlapping colloquia, but thank. It's been a real pleasure to listen to the questions and to hear Michael's responses, and just to see everybody's doing so well. I wish you all a great weekend, and
I would like, by the way, just to thank David Nichols for having read my manuscript through and made some really good comments on it. So just give him some credit.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.